In a captured notebook from 1967, discovered in a Viet Cong base camp near Nui Dat, a political officer wrote something that would puzzle American intelligence analysts for weeks. The entry was brief, clinical, terrifying. Australian patrols walk without sound. They kill before being noticed. When they are near, the jungle gives no warning. The Viet Cong had a name for them. Cái Chết Thầm Lặng, the Silent Death. For years, this phrase appeared in captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and intercepted communications. It described enemy soldiers who moved like water through the jungle, who could track a week-old trail, who killed at ranges so close their victims never heard them coming. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. The men the Viet Cong feared most didn't see themselves as ghosts. They didn't think they had special powers. They were just Australian soldiers doing what they'd been trained to do. As one veteran put it years later, "We weren't ghosts. We were just paying attention." This is the story of why the Viet Cong feared Australian patrols more than almost any other force in Vietnam. And more importantly, this is the story of the men behind that fear, exhausted, professional, and human in every way that mattered. To understand the fear, we need to see through enemy eyes. Viet Cong intelligence officers were meticulous. They studied American patterns, learned their weaknesses, predicted their movements. Within months of American escalation, VC units knew what to expect. Large sweeps, predictable timelines, heavy use of artillery and air support. Then, the Australians arrived in Phuoc Tuy province in 1966, and the reports changed. A captured intelligence summary from late 1966 described Australian patrols as small but extremely dangerous. The analysis continued. They move with discipline we have not observed in other foreign units. They make minimal noise. Their cooking smoke is rare. They read ground sign with uncommon skill. Another document warned, Australian patrols are patient. They will wait for certainty before engaging. This makes them unpredictable. The Viet Cong weren't panicking. They were adapting their doctrine. And that adaptation was based on a simple, chilling realization. The Australians hunted differently. The Americans fought with overwhelming firepower. When contact was made, the response was immediate and massive artillery, gunships, airstrikes, reinforcements. It was effective. But it was also predictable. Australian doctrine was different. Smaller patrols, 5 to 8 men instead of platoon-sized elements. Long-range reconnaissance that lasted days, not hours. Minimal radio traffic. No heavy equipment slowing them down. Where American units often moved with certainty and volume, Australian patrols moved with silence and patience. They didn't announce their presence. They didn't leave obvious trails. A former VC guerrilla interviewed decades later said, "With the Americans, we knew they were coming. We could hear their helicopters, see their dust, smell their cigarettes." The Australians. Sometimes we only knew they had been there after they were gone. But it wasn't just tactics. It was culture. Many Australian soldiers had grown up in the bush. They'd hunted as boys. They understood how to move through scrub without breaking branches, how to read animal behavior, how to track water sources by watching bird patterns. The Vietnamese jungle was different from the Australian outback. Wetter, denser, darker. But the principles remained. Watch where you step. Control your breath. Move with the environment, not against it. One section commander remembered, "Half my blokes had shot rabbits since they were 10. They knew how to be quiet. They knew how to wait." That translated, close. End quote. And the Viet Cong noticed. Reports began describing Australians as having special senses or training we cannot understand. The reality was simpler. It was discipline, patience, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Silence in the jungle isn't just about being quiet. It's about controlling every movement, every breath, every piece of equipment. Australian patrols stripped back everything unnecessary. No metal touching metal, webbing taped down, water bottles wrapped in cloth, dog tags removed or silenced. Even bootlaces were checked for potential noise. When they moved at the edges of tracks, never down the center. Stepping on roots, not loose soil. Testing each footfall before committing weight. The pace was agonizingly slow. Sometimes less than a kilometer per hour. The lead scout would use hand signals for everything. Stop, danger, animal, water, enemy sign. Entire conversations happened without a word spoken. Breath control was critical. In the humidity, panting could be heard from dozens of meters away. Patrols would stop regularly, not to rest, but to let heart rates settle, to breathe through noses, to listen. One veteran described it. You'd stop, and you'd just listen for minutes. Sometimes, you'd hear monkeys resettling. Sometimes, you'd hear the jungle go quiet. That's when you knew something was wrong. The Viet Cong moved carefully. They knew how to conceal trails, how to use false paths, how to sweep footprints. But Australian trackers were relentless. They looked for disturbances most soldiers would miss. A bent blade of grass, mud transferred from one leaf to another, the way morning dew had been disturbed, bruised moss, broken spider webs. A tracker from SASR explained, "You're not looking for a footprint. You're looking for anything that shouldn't be there. A stone flipped the wrong way. A vine pulled sideways. The jungle tells you everything if you're patient enough." Tracking teams could age sign, estimating how long ago someone had passed by, checking moisture levels, insect activity, and plant recovery. Some trackers became so skilled they could tell if a group was male or female based on stride length and foot size. The Viet Cong called this impossible knowledge. It wasn't impossible. It was training, repetition, and countless hours of focus. Every evening, as darkness approached, Australian patrols would conduct a last light halt. They'd stop moving, circle back on their trail to check if they were being followed, then move off at an angle, find concealment, and settle in complete silence. No fires, no cooking. Cold rations eaten in near darkness. Sentries rotated every hour. The entire patrol would remain motionless, listening to the jungle settle around them. The Viet Cong expected patrols to establish defensive positions, to dig in, to make noise. Australians just vanished. One VC fighter recalled, "We would track them during the day. Then at night, nothing. As if they disappeared into the earth." They hadn't disappeared. They were 30 meters away, watching the trail they just left, waiting to see if anyone followed. That patience, that willingness to sit in silence for hours, was the difference between being hunters and being hunted. In early 1967, a Viet Cong company set an ambush along a known Australian patrol route near the long high hills. They prepared for days. Concealed positions, interlocking fire lanes, escape routes marked. They'd studied American doctrine. Wait for the column to enter the kill zone, then open up with everything. The Australian patrol approached just after dawn. But they didn't walk into the kill zone. They stopped short. The lead scout had noticed something, later reports said it was a single leaf positioned incorrectly, possibly disturbed when a VC soldier shifted position. The patrol went to ground. No movement, just watching. 20 minutes passed. Then the Australians did something the VC hadn't anticipated. They didn't withdraw. They didn't call for support. They silently flanked the ambush position, moving through terrain the VC had considered impassable. When the engagement began, it was the VC who were caught in the open. The political officer's report afterward was stark. Enemy patrol demonstrated tactical awareness beyond standard training. They do not react as predicted. Recommend avoidance when possible. A few months later, a VC battalion was tasked with sweeping an area where Australian presence had been reported. Over 300 fighters moved through the target area for 2 days. They found old campsites, cold ration tins, boot prints, but no patrol. The Australians had been there the entire time. 8 men, concealed in thick bamboo barely 50 meters from where the VC battalion commander held a planning meeting. They'd watched, listened, collected intelligence, then extracted without ever being detected. The battalion's after-action report noted, Australian patrol operating in this area is highly skilled. We should avoid detection until we achieve numerical superiority. It was a remarkable admission, a force of over 300 men recommending they avoid contact with 8. Silent didn't mean passive. In August 1967, an Australian patrol detected a VC squad moving along a creek line. The enemy was moving carefully, but not silently, talking quietly, weapons slung. The Australians had time to prepare. They positioned claymore mines, established firing positions, then waited. The VC squad walked past without ever knowing they were being observed. The patrol commander let them pass. He was waiting for something specific, a moment when maximum effect could be achieved with minimal risk. When the claymores detonated, the engagement was over in seconds. A captured VC soldier from a nearby unit said later, "We heard the explosion. When we came to help, there was nothing. No enemy. Just our dead. It was like ghosts had done this." They weren't ghosts. They were professionals who understood that violence delayed is often violence controlled. By late 1967, certain areas of Phuoc Thu province were being marked in VC planning documents as Australian hunting grounds. Local force units were instructed to avoid these areas unless absolutely necessary. Main force units approaching them would do so with increased caution. Some trails were simply abandoned. It wasn't that the Australians controlled this ground, they didn't have the numbers for that. It was that the cost of operating there had become too high. The VC couldn't move without wondering if they were being watched, couldn't rest without checking every shadow. One former guerrilla put it simply, "In those areas, we were never comfortable. We never felt alone." And that psychological weight was perhaps the most effective weapon the Australians deployed. The legend says ghosts. The reality says mud, exhaustion, and constant vigilance. Heat that turned equipment into burning metal. Humidity that soaked through everything within minutes. Leeches that would crawl into boots, under collar lines, into ears. Jungle rot that turned small cuts into infected wounds. Water was carried, rationed, and craved. A man could sweat through 2 liters in an hour and never piss once. Dehydration was a constant companion. Movement was exhausting, not because of distance a patrol might cover only 2 kilometers in a day, but because of the concentration required. Every step evaluated. Every sound analyzed, every shadow assessed. One veteran remembered, you'd finish a patrol and your legs wouldn't even be sore, but your mind would be absolutely cooked. You'd been concentrating that hard for that long. Silence does something to men. In a normal infantry unit, there's chatter, banter, noise that fills the space and keeps minds occupied. In an Australian long-range patrol, there was nothing but jungle sounds and your own thoughts. Hours would pass without a word spoken. Days, sometimes. You'd communicate with hand signals, eye contact, and learned intuition. That silence amplified everything. The snap of a twig became deafening. A bird call could spike your heart rate. Your own breathing sounded like a freight train. And underneath it all was a constant question. Are we being watched right now? Because the Viet Cong were skilled too. They could be patient too. They knew the ground better than anyone. One section commander said, "The worst part wasn't the contact. It was the waiting. Knowing that at any second someone could open up, and you wouldn't see them until it was too late." But even in silence, there was connection. A shared glance when something didn't feel right. A hand on a shoulder when someone froze at a sound. The way a section would instinctively protect each other's blind spots without needing orders. Mateship, that uniquely Australian concept, didn't require words. When a patrol stopped for a break, men would check each other's equipment without being asked. Share water if someone was running low. Take extra watch shifts if someone was sick. Humor survived too. Quiet, dark, necessary humor. A joke told in whispers during a last light halt. A shared grin when something absurd happened. The kind of laughter that kept men sane when sanity felt like a luxury. One digger remembered. We'd been silent for 3 days. Absolutely nothing spoken. Then one bloke steps on a mud patch and goes straight down. Just vanishes into this stinking black bog. When we pulled him out, he's covered head to toe, and he just whispers, "Well, that's fucked then." We all lost it. Trying not to laugh out loud while this bloke drips swamp water. That kind of moment kept you going. Section commanders in the Australian Army didn't lead by shouting orders. They led by example and trust. In a patrol, the commander was just another man in the line, often positioned 3rd or 4th, where he could see forward and back. He relied on his lead scout's judgment, trusted his number 2 to watch the flanks, depended on every man to think independently. When decisions needed to be made, they were made quickly and quietly. A hand signal, a whispered word, then execution. This style of leadership, decentralized, trust-based, professional, was why Australian patrols could react so effectively under pressure. There was no delay waiting for orders. Every man knew his role. Every man acted. Contact in the jungle was chaos, compressed into seconds. After hours, sometimes days of silence, the sudden eruption of gunfire was overwhelming, disorienting. The world went from whisper quiet to ear-shattering in a heartbeat. Australian doctrine emphasized controlled aggression, fire discipline, aimed shots. But in close jungle, firefights happened at ranges measured in meters, not hundreds of meters. You'd see muzzle flash through bamboo, hear rounds snapping past, smell cordite and torn vegetation. Men would be shooting at shapes, at movement, at sound. And then sometimes as quickly as it started, it would stop. The silence afterward was different. Heavy, filled with ringing ears and adrenaline. Men checking themselves for hits they hadn't felt, checking their mates, counting rounds. Being silent didn't make them invincible. Australian casualties in Vietnam were proportionally lower than many Allied forces, but every loss was felt deeply. In small patrols, every man mattered. Every face was known. Every story was shared. When a man was hit, the patrol moved to protect him immediately, covering fire, suppression, medical aid under pressure, sometimes carrying wounded through terrain that had been difficult enough to walk through unburdened. Dust-off helicopters would come in hot, rotors thrashing jungle canopy, while the patrol held a perimeter. The wounded would be lifted out. The patrol would fade back into the bush. But they'd carry that loss with them. In the silence. In the spaces where voices should have been. One veteran said, "You lose a mate, and the jungle gets quieter. Like even the place knows something's gone wrong." The constant vigilance wore on men in ways that weren't always visible. Sleep came in fragmented doses. An hour here, 30 minutes there. Always one ear open. Always ready to move. Some men developed hypervigilance that lasted years after they returned home. Others struggled with the shift from constant alertness to civilian normality. The world felt too loud, too chaotic, too careless. And there was guilt too. Survivor's guilt. The question of why you made it home when others didn't. The weight of kills even justified, even necessary, that stayed with men long after the war ended. For all their skill, Australian soldiers knew they weren't invincible. They knew the VC were learning, adapting, setting traps specifically designed to counter Australian tactics. There were moments when every man felt it. The creeping certainty that you were no longer the hunter, that somewhere in the green darkness, someone was watching you, the way you'd been watching them. Those moments defined the difference between confidence and arrogance, between professional respect for your enemy and underestimation. The Australians never underestimated the Viet Cong. That's part of why they survived. When the Australian Army created the Special Air Service Regiment, they drew heavily on lessons from Vietnam. The patrol techniques, the silence discipline, the tracking skills, the emphasis on small team operations, and individual initiative. Training schools still reference patrol reports from Vietnam. Instructors still teach the same principles. Control your noise. Read the ground. Trust your mates. Think independently. A modern SASR operator said, "We still teach the last light halt exactly the way they did it in Vietnam, because it still works. The basics don't change." By 1969, American units were studying Australian methods. Long-range reconnaissance patrols began adopting smaller team sizes, more emphasis on stealth over firepower, extended training in tracking and fieldcraft. American advisors embedded with Australian units took those lessons back. Some of the most effective American reconnaissance teams in the latter years of the war were using modified Australian tactics. It was an acknowledgement. The Australians had figured something out. Something that worked. Decades after the war, when Vietnamese and Australian veterans met for reconciliation events, the respect was mutual. Former Viet Cong fighters would speak openly about the fear Australian patrols inspired, but they also spoke about professional respect, about recognizing skill in an enemy. One VC veteran said, "They were worthy opponents. We knew if we faced Australians, we had to be perfect. One mistake and they would find us. That knowledge made us better soldiers." In a strange way, they taught us by hunting us. It was war. There was death and loss and trauma on all sides. But there was also a recognition soldier to soldier of competence, courage, and professionalism. What's remarkable about the Silent Death legend is that it survived because it was grounded in truth. The Viet Cong didn't fear Australians because of propaganda or myth. They feared them because Australian patrols were genuinely skilled, genuinely disciplined, and genuinely dangerous. And the Australians didn't swagger or boast about that fear. They just did their jobs. They looked after their mates. They came home when they could. Years later, when veterans would talk about Vietnam, they didn't talk about being ghosts or silent death. They talked about mates who didn't make it home, about jungle that still haunted their dreams, about moments of fear and exhaustion and dark humor. They talked about being human. The captured notebook that opened this story contained more than just that single entry. On the final page, the political officer had written an operational summary, recommendations for units operating in areas where Australian patrols were active. The last line read, "Avoid them when possible. They will find you before you find them." It was a simple tactical assessment, clinical, based on hard experience, but it represented something larger. An acknowledgement that these soldiers, these men from the far side of the world, had brought skills and discipline that changed the calculus of jungle warfare. Ask those same veterans what they were doing in the jungle, and you'll get a different answer. We weren't hunting. We were surviving. I never felt like a ghost. I felt like a bloke who was tired and scared and doing his best. The jungle wasn't our enemy. The jungle just was. We learned to work with it. There's no bravado in these reflections, no chest thumping, just the quiet acknowledgement of hard work in impossible circumstances. The silent death wasn't a myth, but it wasn't magic either. It was the result of discipline, training, a culture that valued mateship and initiative, and men who understood that in the jungle, patience and silence could mean the difference between life and death. The Viet Cong feared Australian patrols not because they were supernatural. They feared them because they were professional. They moved like they'd been taught. They fought like they'd been trained. They protected their mates like it was the only thing that mattered. And at the end of the day, when the patrol came back in, when weapons were cleaned and after action reports were written, they were just Australian soldiers. Exhausted, professional, human. Somewhere in Phuoc Tuy province, the jungle has reclaimed the trails. The patrol bases are gone. The fire-based positions are overgrown. But the stories remain in VC memoirs and Australian war diaries, in training manuals and veteran reunions, in quiet conversations where old soldiers remember mates who didn't come home. The silent death wasn't about fear. Not really. It was about men doing hard work in impossible conditions, about professionalism under pressure, about mateship in the darkest moments. And that, more than any legend, is worth remembering. For the diggers who walked quietly, for those who came home, and those who didn't, lest we forget.